A cold mist settles over the Thames Valley as dusk presses against the stone facade of Cliveden House. From a distance, it looks almost silent, untouched by time, yet within its walls, centuries of decisions, alliances, and private conversations have already shaped the course of a nation. This is not simply a country estate. It is a place where power learned to disguise itself as elegance. Long before it became associated with political scandal and national collapse, Cliveden House began as an assertion of aristocratic ambition carved into the English landscape. The story opens in the late 17th century, when England itself was still recalibrating after civil war, monarchy restoration, and the shifting architecture of elite power. In 1666, the land was acquired by George Villiers, the second Duke of Buckingham, a man deeply embedded in the court politics of his time. He envisioned not merely a residence but a statement, a physical embodiment of status, influence, and permanence. Construction of the original Cliveden House began in 1666 and was completed in 1668. It stood perched above the River Thames, deliberately positioned to dominate both land and water routes. Even in its earliest form, Cliveden was not passive architecture. It was surveillance in stone, its terraces and sightlines engineered for visibility and control. The Duke hosted political allies, literary figures, and royal acquaintances here, using the estate as a private extension of court influence. In this period, political power in England was still deeply personal, and Cliveden functioned as a salon of decision-making disguised as leisure. But aristocratic fortunes rarely remained stable for long. After Buckingham's death, Cliveden passed through multiple hands, each reshaping the estate to reflect their own era's definition of prestige. Fires, reconstruction, and redesign marked its early centuries, erasing and rebuilding its identity layer by layer. By the 18th century, the estate had already begun to evolve from a private residence into a symbol of continuity within the shifting British elite. It was in the 19th century, however, that Cliveden underwent its most dramatic transformation. In 1849, the estate was purchased by George Sutherland Levis and Gower, the second Duke of Sutherland. Under his ownership, Cliveden was rebuilt on a monumental scale after a devastating fire destroyed much of the earlier structure in 1795. The reconstruction was entrusted to architect Charles Barry, the same mind behind the Palace of Westminster. What emerged was not simply a rebuilt mansion, but a reinvention of aristocratic identity itself. The new Cliveden, completed in 1851, was designed in the Italianate style, grand, symmetrical, and theatrical. Its long terraces overlooked meticulously sculpted gardens descending toward the Thames, creating a controlled dialogue between nature and architecture. Everything about it communicated order imposed upon landscape, wealth translated into geometry. In Victorian Britain, where industrial expansion was rapidly redefining class structures, estates like Cliveden became the last bastions of hereditary authority. They were not just homes, they were ideological fortresses. By the late 19th century, Cliveden had passed into the hands of the Astor family, marking another critical shift in its social identity. This was no longer purely old aristocracy, it was the merging of British nobility with transatlantic wealth. William Waldorf Astor, an American-born financier who had become one of the richest men of his era, purchased Cliveden in 1893. His acquisition reflected a broader transformation occurring across Europe. Money was no longer confined by lineage, and influence was becoming increasingly global. Under the Astors, Cliveden entered a new phase as a political and intellectual gathering point. Nancy Astor, the first woman to take a seat in the British House of Commons, transformed the estate into a center of elite social and political exchange during the early 20th century. Her presence shifted Cliveden's identity from inherited aristocratic monument to active political salon. Weekends at the house brought together prime ministers, diplomats, writers, and industrialists. Conversations over dinner were not casual. They were rehearsals for policy, diplomacy, and ideological alignment. The gardens and terraces, once designed for aristocratic display, now became stages for political interaction. Decisions that would influence British governance were often discussed informally within its drawing rooms. Cliveden's function was evolving again, from symbol to salon to semi-private political instrument. Yet beneath its cultivated surface, the house was accumulating something more complex, layers of influence that were no longer fully visible or accountable. As the 20th century advanced, Britain itself was entering a period of instability. The aftermath of World War I had fractured old certainties, and the rise of new political ideologies across Europe created an atmosphere of suspicion and strategic anxiety. Wealthy estates like Cliveden were no longer just social spaces. They were perceived as potential nodes of intelligence exchange, diplomatic signaling, and informal power negotiation. During the interwar years, Cliveden hosted figures from across the political spectrum. Some came for leisure, others for influence, and many for reasons that were never publicly recorded. What distinguished Cliveden from other estates was not only its grandeur, but its consistency as a meeting point across decades. Governments changed, wars erupted, alliances shifted, but Cliveden remained present, adapting to each era without losing its function as a private nexus of elite interaction. By the time the Second World War reshaped global power structures, Cliveden had already acquired a reputation that extended beyond Britain. It was known quietly within political circles as a place where introductions mattered, where access was curated, and where informal conversations often preceded formal decisions. Yet even then, the estate had not yet reached the moment that would define its place in history. In the post-war world, Britain was no longer the unquestioned center of global power. The empire was contracting, Cold War tensions were rising, and domestic politics were under increasing scrutiny. In this environment, spaces like Cliveden took on a more ambiguous role. They were at once relics of old authority and active participants in a new, more precarious political landscape. The house itself, however, remained unchanged in its physical presence. Its limestone facade still reflected the shifting English light with quiet confidence. Its gardens still descended in controlled symmetry toward the river, but beneath that stillness, Cliveden had become something more complicated than architecture or tradition. It had become a container of access, who entered, who spoke, and who influenced whom all mattered in ways that were rarely recorded but deeply felt. And as the mid-20th century approached, a new kind of social energy began to circulate through its rooms. The old aristocratic certainty was fading, replaced by a looser, more volatile mix of politics, celebrity, intelligence, and ambition. Cliveden was no longer simply observing history, it was quietly moving toward its most consequential chapter. Because behind the polished rituals of weekend gatherings and diplomatic dinners, something less stable was forming, an invisible network of relationships that would eventually intersect with politics at the highest level. And once that intersection occurred, the illusion of control that had defined Cliveden for centuries would begin to fracture. What no one could yet see was that the house had already entered its final phase as a purely private world. The line between social gathering place and political pressure point was beginning to blur. And when that line finally broke, it would not be contained within the walls of Cliveden House again. A low winter light hangs over Cliveden as the post-war world settles into a quieter but more anxious rhythm. The war is over, the empire is thinning, yet Britain feels anything but stable. Beneath the surface of recovery, another struggle is unfolding, less visible than armies, but just as consequential. It is a struggle of influence, access, and proximity to power. And once again, Cliveden House sits at its center, quietly absorbing the tensions of an age that no longer trusts its own institutions. By the 1950s, Cliveden House had transitioned fully into its role as a high-level social nexus rather than a traditional aristocratic residence. The Astor family still held ownership, and Nancy Astor's legacy continued to shape its reputation as a place where political and intellectual elites could meet outside formal government structures. But the character of these gatherings had subtly changed. The old certainty of aristocratic authority was fading, replaced by a more fragmented elite culture, one where diplomats, journalists, artists, and political operators moved through the same rooms with increasingly blurred boundaries. Britain itself was now operating under the shadow of the Cold War. Intelligence agencies, both domestic and foreign, expanded their attention towards social spaces where information could circulate informally. In this climate, houses like Cliveden were no longer just symbolic estates. They were potential intersections of influence, where personal relationships could overlap with matters of national security without any formal record. The distinction between conversation and intelligence was becoming harder to define. It is within this atmosphere that the social world surrounding Cliveden began to tighten into smaller, more interconnected circles. Weekend gatherings became less about aristocratic tradition and more about proximity, who knew whom, who introduced whom, and who was seen speaking to whom. Reputation itself became a kind of currency, and access to Cliveden's social orbit implied a level of trust that extended far beyond the estate's physical boundaries. During this period, a key figure began to move through London's more unconventional social circuits: Stephen Ward. A trained osteopath by profession, Ward was far more significant socially than his official title suggested. He cultivated relationships across class boundaries, connecting artists, aristocrats, diplomats, and political figures in a way that made him both useful and controversial. His charm lay not in wealth or lineage, but in access. He knew people who knew power, and he made introductions that others could not easily replicate. Ward's presence in elite social environments did not begin at Cliveden itself, but his network increasingly overlapped with those who were connected to it. He operated in a world where social gatherings were not merely entertainment, but mechanisms of placement. Introductions mattered, visibility mattered, and proximity to influential figures could shift a person's entire trajectory. It was through this expanding social web that Ward became connected to a young woman whose presence would later become central to one of Britain's most damaging political scandals: Christine Keeler. Keeler was part of a post-war generation that existed outside traditional elite structures. She moved through London's nightlife and artistic circles, environments that were increasingly intersecting with the edges of political and diplomatic society. In the rigid hierarchy of British class systems, she occupied a space that was both visible and unprotected, close enough to power to be noticed, but not embedded within it. What made this period particularly volatile was the way different social worlds were beginning to overlap without clear boundaries. Government ministers, intelligence-linked figures, entertainers, and informal social operators were now more likely to encounter each other in private residences and informal gatherings than in official settings. Cliveden's broader social ecosystem was part of this pattern. It was not the only space where such interactions occurred, but it was one of the most symbolically significant. By the early 1960s, Britain's political leadership was under increasing pressure. The Conservative government was navigating Cold War diplomacy, domestic economic challenges, and growing public skepticism about elite integrity. In this environment, even informal associations carried potential consequences. A private conversation could become a public liability if exposed. A social connection could be reinterpreted as political vulnerability. It is within this tightening atmosphere that John Profumo enters the narrative. Profumo was a rising figure in government, holding a senior defense position at a time when military intelligence and Cold War strategy were deeply intertwined. His public role carried expectations of discipline and credibility, particularly given the geopolitical sensitivities of the era. The social overlap between Profumo's world and the circles surrounding Ward and Keeler did not begin as a formal political issue. It began, as many such intersections do, through casual introduction at a private gathering. In London's elite social structure of the time, introductions were often treated as harmless formalities, gestures of politeness rather than acts of consequence. Yet in hindsight, these introductions formed the fragile infrastructure of what would become a national crisis. As these circles began to intersect more frequently, the environment around Cliveden and its extended social network grew increasingly charged with unspoken tension. Conversations that might once have been dismissed as trivial began to acquire significance when viewed through the lens of security and reputation. The Cold War had introduced a new kind of sensitivity to social interaction, one in which perception could be as dangerous as action. What distinguished Cliveden's broader social sphere from ordinary elite gatherings was not any single event, but the density of relationships it contained. It functioned as a convergence point where individuals from different layers of society could meet without the formal oversight that characterized government or institutional environments. This made it both influential and inherently unstable. The same informality that made it attractive also made it difficult to control. By the time early rumors began circulating within London's political and journalistic circles, the network around Cliveden was already under implicit observation from multiple directions, not in a coordinated or fully documented sense, but in the way that high-profile social ecosystems naturally attract attention when they become too interconnected. Small inconsistencies, repeated encounters, and unusual associations began to accumulate meaning. At first, these signals remained fragmented, discussed in private, dismissed in public, and only partially understood even by those closest to them. But the structure of the situation was already changing. What had once been a fluid social environment was beginning to harden into a narrative framework that others would eventually interpret as scandal. Within this atmosphere, even the idea of Cliveden itself began to shift. It was no longer just a backdrop for elite social life. It was becoming a reference point, a name that implied a network, a set of relationships, and an emerging sense of political risk. The house remained physically unchanged, but its symbolic function was evolving rapidly. And as the early 1960s progressed, the fragile balance between privacy and exposure continued to narrow. The people moving through these circles were still operating as if the old rules of discretion applied. Yet the world around them had already changed. Information moved faster, institutions were less forgiving, and once a story reached the surface of public attention, it rarely remained contained. The conditions were now in place for a shift that no one within Cliveden's extended orbit fully anticipated. A chain of associations had formed, subtle, informal, and initially invisible, that linked private lives to public consequence. It was not yet a scandal, but it was no longer just social life either. And once that realization began to surface in fragments across London's political and journalistic landscape, the distance between rumor and collapse would prove far shorter than anyone expected. The first cracks appeared quietly. A whisper passed between journalists. A question emerged in a parliamentary corridor. A rumor that might once have died within London's private social circles instead continued to spread, gathering attention with every retelling. By early 1963, the network of relationships that had developed around Cliveden's social world was no longer a matter of private curiosity. It was becoming a matter of public concern. For years, Britain's governing class had operated under assumptions that seemed almost permanent. Politicians, aristocrats, diplomats, and influential social figures existed within overlapping circles protected by discretion and convention. The public rarely saw behind the curtain. Newspapers often respected boundaries that today would seem unimaginable. Reputation could survive because information moved slowly and because many institutions preferred silence over exposure. But Britain in the 1960s was changing. A younger generation of journalists had become more willing to challenge established authority. Public trust in institutions was becoming less automatic. The old rules that had protected elite figures were weakening, and the events connected to the growing scandal would soon reveal just how vulnerable the political establishment had become. At the center of the crisis stood John Profumo. As Secretary of State for War, Profumo occupied one of the most sensitive positions in the British government. During the Cold War, defense matters were inseparable from national security. Every decision, every relationship, and every public statement carried heightened significance. What might have been viewed as a personal matter in another era now had the potential to become a national issue. Questions began to circulate regarding Profumo's relationship with Christine Keeler. On their own, allegations of a private relationship would have been embarrassing enough. But the situation became far more serious because of concerns surrounding Keeler's connections to other individuals, including a Soviet naval attaché, at a time when Cold War tensions shaped nearly every aspect of security policy. Whether sensitive information had actually been compromised became almost secondary to the perception of risk. In politics, perception can be as destructive as fact. The possibility that a senior government minister might have been linked, even indirectly, to circumstances involving potential security concerns generated enormous anxiety within official circles. Ministers worried about government credibility. Intelligence officials worried about public confidence. Political opponents saw opportunity. Journalists sensed a story that was growing larger by the day. As scrutiny intensified, Profumo faced increasing pressure to address the allegations publicly. In March 1963, he stood before the House of Commons and denied any impropriety. For a moment, the statement appeared to stabilize the situation. Many hoped the controversy would fade. Public denials from senior ministers still carried significant weight, and some believed the matter would quietly disappear. But the pressure did not vanish. Instead, new information continued to emerge. Investigative reporting persisted. Private conversations became public knowledge. Individuals connected to the affair found themselves under intense examination. Every new revelation increased doubts about the government's version of events. Then came the turning point. In June 1963, only a few months after his parliamentary denial, Profumo admitted that his earlier statement had been false. He acknowledged that he had misled Parliament regarding his relationship with Keeler. The confession detonated like a political bomb. In British political culture, personal misconduct could sometimes be survived. Misleading Parliament was another matter entirely. The issue was no longer merely about a private relationship. It was about honesty, accountability, and the integrity of government itself. Profumo resigned immediately. His political career, once considered highly promising, was effectively over. Yet the resignation did not end the scandal. In many ways, it marked the beginning of its most destructive phase. The public wanted answers. Newspapers demanded explanations. Political opponents pushed for investigations. Every institution connected to the affair came under scrutiny. The scandal rapidly expanded beyond the actions of any single individual. Attention turned toward the wider social network surrounding the events. Questions emerged about class privilege, elite secrecy, and the informal systems through which powerful people interacted beyond public oversight. Suddenly, the world represented by Cliveden appeared very different from how it had once been perceived. What had previously seemed glamorous now appeared suspicious. What had seemed exclusive now appeared unaccountable. And what had seemed like harmless social networking now looked, to many observers, like a dangerous blending of influence, privilege, and political power. No figure experienced this shift more dramatically than Stephen Ward. Ward became a central focus of public attention. For years, he had moved comfortably between different social classes, introducing people from vastly different backgrounds and helping maintain connections across elite circles. Yet as the scandal intensified, many observers began to treat him as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. The legal case against Ward generated enormous controversy. His trial attracted intense media coverage and public fascination. Day after day, newspapers reported on testimony, allegations, and revelations. The proceedings seemed to expose not only individual behavior, but also the hidden workings of a social system that many ordinary citizens had never previously seen. Under extraordinary pressure and facing public humiliation, Ward's life began to unravel. In July 1963, before the conclusion of the trial, he suffered a drug overdose. He died shortly afterward. His death added another tragic chapter to a scandal already filled with personal destruction. By then, the affair had evolved far beyond its original circumstances. It had become a national reckoning. Government credibility suffered immense damage. Public faith in political leadership weakened. The image of a disciplined and trustworthy ruling class was replaced by one of secrecy, privilege, and deception. The consequences extended directly into electoral politics. The governing Conservative administration, already facing multiple challenges, found its reputation severely weakened. Although the Profumo Affair was not the sole reason for later political changes, it contributed significantly to the erosion of public confidence that affected the government in the years that followed. Historians continue to debate the precise political impact of the scandal, but few dispute its symbolic importance. The affair marked a turning point in the relationship between Britain's rulers and its citizens. After Profumo, it became increasingly difficult for political leaders to rely on old assumptions of privacy and deference. Journalists became more aggressive. Public expectations of transparency increased. Political scandals would never again be handled quite the same way. And at the edge of this transformation stood Cliveden. The mansion itself had not issued statements, it had not held office, it had not participated in parliamentary debates. Yet its name became permanently linked to the affair. For centuries, Cliveden had represented aristocratic power, social prestige, and elite influence. It had survived fires, changing dynasties, world wars, and enormous social transformations. Through each era, it adapted while preserving its status as one of Britain's great houses. But after 1963, it acquired another identity. It became a symbol. To some, it symbolized the dangers of privilege operating beyond public accountability. To others, it represented the fading world of old elite networks struggling to survive in a more transparent age. And to historians, it remains a remarkable lens through which to examine the collision between private influence and public responsibility. Today, visitors walking through the terraces of Cliveden House encounter a place of extraordinary beauty. The gardens remain meticulously maintained. The architecture still commands attention. The views across the Thames Valley remain as impressive as they were centuries ago. Yet beneath the elegance lies a deeper story. Every stone, pathway, and grand room exists within a landscape shaped not only by wealth and architecture, but also by politics, ambition, and human fallibility. The mansion that once hosted dukes, statesmen, writers, and diplomats eventually became associated with one of the most consequential political scandals in modern British history. Its legacy endures because it illustrates a timeless truth. Power rarely collapses in public first. It weakens behind closed doors through assumptions, relationships, and decisions made far from public view. By the time the world notices, the foundations may already be cracking. And that is why the story of Cliveden House continues to fascinate more than half a century later. Not because it was merely the setting of a scandal, but because it revealed how an entire system of influence operated, and how, for one extraordinary moment in history, the walls that had protected that system finally gave way.